So Luke, today you were going to comment on whether or not the Democrats underperformed in the 2020 election, and if so, why? Is that right?
Yes, that is right, Michael. The Democrats in the 2020 election, they of course did win the presidency with Joe Biden, even though Donald Trump hasn't admitted that yet. Across the board, you look at the places like the Senate, the House, Democrats didn't do as well as some would have expected. So what we're going to go through here is we're going to try and answer that question. Why did they underperform? But first off, I guess I just want to talk about, the narrative that they actually did do well. Because I have heard some people say no. And their argument is, well, it's very hard to win a presidential election against an incumbent. Dole, Kerry and Romney all failed. The last time it happened was 1992, 28 years ago. And that occurred because of an economic recession. But of course, you had those Trump books. You didn't have those Bush books in 1992. In the end, it wasn't that close in terms of the Electoral College. 306 to 232. Biden won. Same margin as Trump and Clinton in 2016. Biden is also going to get 80 million votes and win the popular votes by 5 million, more than 2016, 2012, 2004, and 2000. Only Obama's win in 2008 had a bigger popular vote gap in the last 20 years.
Wow.
7 out of 8 times, by the way, in the last 8 elections, the Democrats have won the popular vote in the presidential race. Yeah, overall, are the Dems in disarray? I mean, look, they won the presidency, right? Biden beat an incumbent. Quite a hard thing to do. Well, if we scratch below the surface, we can see it was actually a lot closer than maybe it seems, and that's because of the Electoral College. Yes, Biden won Wisconsin by 20,000, Georgia by 10,000, and Arizona by around 10,000. That's across, 3 states. If 20,000 people changed their votes out of, 11.5 million people across those 3 states mentioned, just 20,000 people changed their votes, Trump and Biden would tie on 269.
And electorally speaking, that is slimmer than the margin that Trump won by, because I think I remember hearing Trump won by something like 70,000 votes if you're talking about the tipping point Electoral College states.
Yeah, I think it was about 77,000 across 3 states. And this, of course, it's a tie, so Trump wouldn't win, but, we're talking 40,000. So that's almost half. So yeah, it was actually quite a bit tighter than the Electoral College suggested. Kind of the same as in 2016. And that is, of course, a problem with the Electoral College that you have outlined in your video that you've recently uploaded. But, that is the game that is played. I mean, both sides know it. You have to win the Electoral College. And Biden just squeaked over the line, even though he got so many more votes overall. If you look at the Senate as well, there's more evidence that the Dems underperformed. They only gained a couple of seats and are going to have to rely on the Georgia special election to tie the Senate at 50-50. So there's a slim chance of them getting it because then Kamala Harris, who would be the VP, would be the deciding vote. Susan Collins winning in Maine, I think, is a great example of the Dems underperforming. I mean, you consider what the polls say and then the result where Collins won comfortably. It's just shocking. And you can see the polling up there on your screen now. Also, the Dems lost seats in Congress. Practically all the toss-ups, by the New York Times went to the GOP. They'll still hold on to the House, though. But if we look at state legislatures, the Dems didn't flip any. And this is crucial, since those state legislatures will decide on new congressional seats, because of course the census finishes in 2020. There's new seats to be awarded to places like Texas, for instance, and Pennsylvania will probably lose seats as well. And so, the Republicans will get to decide how to divvy up those seats and where the geographic locations of those seats will be, which is of course called gerrymandering. And the Republicans have been doing that for ages, and they'll still continue to be able to do that as well. It doesn't look for the Democrats going into the midterms in 2022. So all of this is bad news for them. And the question we're going to dive into is why, Michael? Why is this the case? Firstly, you agree that it was bad news for them?
No, I mean, I've definitely agreed. If you look at the next 4 years and how it seems like things are going to develop in America, when you look at Trump disputing the vote, when you look at the fact that Trump's going to potentially start his own media outlet, all the things, it suggests that the Democrats are not in a comfortable situation for 2024, which is obviously not what you might think when you look at just the popular vote, you think, well, of course they're going to be in a comfortable position. They won by 5.5 million. But the reality is, yeah, like you say, they scraped through in a lot of states. And the reality is that it kind of doesn't feel as if Biden does have much of a mandate. So yeah, I agree with you that the Democrats are in a bad situation from their perspective.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair to say. And we're now going to go through why they didn't do as well. And I'm going to be using Asita Nuevu's article called Don't Blame the Left for Democratic Losses. And I kind of agree with that, as you can tell. But that article will be used as a backbone for the arguments that have been presented all across the spectrum as to why this happened. So the first argument was that the Democrats are, I guess, too left-wing overall. They talk about socialism, they talk about Black Lives Matter, they talk about defund the police, etc., all these phrases, and that puts off moderate voters. This is from the article. Moderates, naturally, this is in the Democratic Party, are insisting the party has veered too far to the left, and it's time for the House's left-leaning stars to shut up. One of the more prominent voices in their camp has been Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, a member of 2018's freshman class from Virginia, who took House leadership to the woodshed in the now infamous caucus call last week. Don't say socialism, she yelled. Don't say defund the police, when that's not what we mean. Those comments have been broadly seconded. We've got to be clear we're not for defunding the police and allowing that lie to continue to be out there. New York Congressman Greg Meeks recently told Politico, we're not for defunding the police and we're not socialists. Interestingly, by the way, Spanberger is ex-CIA. So she might have another interest in making sure that the police, any conversations about the police or law enforcement being defunded don't happen. I mean, interestingly, no Democrat actually ran on defunding the police. But we'll continue. Spanberger was one of the freshman House Democrats elected in 2018's Blue Wave. In the months before that happened in the midterms, President Trump and Republican candidates aggressively pushed messaging on a variety of subjects they hoped would rally the base and alarm suburban moderates. So we're talking about stuff like socialism, Antifa, the Kavanaugh confirmation, Confederate monuments, and of course migrant caravans. I remember the caravans. That's quickly been forgotten. And Asita points out that the last of these was tethered to another controversial headline-grabbing policy proposal pundits have already forgotten, abolishing ICE. Polling that summer showed only 25% of Americans supported the idea. Unlike defunding the police, a number of mainstream prominent Democrats backed or signalled willingness to take it seriously. Progressives, including caucus chair Premier Jay Powell, actually introduced a bill to dismantle the agency. It was said by many that this would be a death sentence for the party's fortunes that year. In the end, Democrats gained 41 seats. So yeah, that's interesting. You look back to 2018, the same attacks were levied out on the Democrats, but they did quite a bit better. Almost as if, defund the police didn't actually have that big an impact.
Basically that does sound pretty convincing, that the situation was that when the Democrats do push for these progressive policies, it doesn't put off their base, which is sort of what you would expect naturally from a progressive party, that when they push for policies that are progressive, they're not going to have too much of an issue. And obviously this was in the context of ICE in particular being on an institutional level quite objectionable, with putting children in cages and all that kind of stuff. So it would make sense to people who consider themselves progressives, which would be a decent number of the people who support Democrats. And also people who consider themselves liberal would of course be against putting children in cages because they've crossed the border. You'd think most people are against that, and obviously in that context it's somewhat unsurprising that people would be like, yeah, we support abolishing ICE.
No, absolutely. And also there was this comment from James Clyburn, by the way, the number one recipient of big pharma money in the whole of Congress, or at least on the Democrat side, I believe. And Clyburn, of course, one of the big backers of Joe Biden from South Carolina, had a comment after the election saying that defund the police cost Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. He was up against Lindsey Graham in the Senate race and he lost. The thing is, that slogan came to prominence in July, and Harrison was polling quite well in October 2020. So I don't know why voters would be okay with Harrison in October, and suddenly a week before the election, all this defund the police stuff, which happened, months ago, would catch him out. And it could be that the Barrett confirmation helped Lindsey Graham, hugging Feinstein, convinced people that, okay, Lindsey Graham, he's still good, he still gets the conservative justices through, and he's still, it was still a good confirmation process, nothing wrong. I'm not sure, that's just one theory. But the whole idea that the defund the police and therefore Black Lives Matter hurt the Democrats is just stupid, because if you look at this graph that's up on the screen, when George Floyd died in Minneapolis, you can see when the Black Lives Matter movement started, you can see Democrats had a massive rise in voter registration. And it was crazy. I think in Michigan alone, there was about 30,000 Democrats who registered just in June. You know, the gap between Trump and Biden grew in the polls as well. I remember that, like Biden gained. To argue that Black Lives Matter and therefore defund the police and all that cost people like Jamie Harrison, again, in South Carolina, maybe it just wasn't possible. But yeah, no, it's ridiculous. Like, it clearly got the Democratic voter base engaged with the election. And again, there's very little evidence overall that actually made a difference, as we'll go on to later. Other elements made a far bigger difference than defund the police or Black Lives Matter or socialism or whatever. These attacks could maybe work if you don't define yourself as anything. If you're just a moderate like Jamie Harrison, who's just quite wishy-washy, or even Joe Biden, like the soul of the nation. You know, we're going to work for the people of South Carolina. Just no actual policies that you stand for allows your opponents to define you.
That's actually a really interesting point, I think. Because, basically, if the problem with a lot of the liberal moderate Democrats is because they don't have a firm position that they stand to, it would make it easier for other people to attack them under this label. And the thing is, the progressives are obviously going to be the ones getting their message out there, because they're the ones who have a very firm, solid message that they clearly believe in and clearly care a lot about getting out there. So they're going to be the ones presenting that image, whereas the career Democrats aren't going to have a message that they're getting out there. So obviously the Republicans and conservatives in general are going to say, well, everybody on the Democrat side must be progressive. So in a sense, it's almost like, if the career Democrats and the moderate Democrats want to not be, I guess, tarnished, as they say it, with the brush of progressivism, the first thing they need to do is actually have some more robust, I guess, principles when it comes to what they stand for. Even if they're going to stand for a moderate position, that they can actually, in a more meaningful sense, defend that position rather than being, like what you said, wishy-washy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of like John Ossoff in the recent Senate race in Georgia, and he had this interview where he said he's not for Medicare for all, he's not for the Green New Deal, he's not for defunding the police. He just had a yes or no session with the interviewer, and he just told the interviewer everything he's not for. And the interviewer didn't ask him once, like, what is John Ossoff actually for? And he doesn't appear to have an answer from everything I've seen. And that's the case. Like, what do the mainstream Democrats stand for? The soul of the nation, apparently, according to Biden. But anyway, the next, I guess, argument is ticket splitting hurt the Democrats. So voters who didn't like Trump in 2016 wanted to register their disapproval. The thinking is, they had to support the Democrats down ballot in 2018. However, when it comes to 2016, many anti-Trump moderates could register their opposition to Trump just by directly voting for Biden while continuing to support other Republican candidates. And this pattern would effectively be, I guess, an instantation of Biden's messaging. Much of the campaign was spent insisting that Trump is an aberration, severable from the Republican Party as a whole, and that Biden would be able to work with the GOP once elected. And perhaps a non-trivial proportion of his supporters agreed. They voted for Republicans.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. Biden keeps saying, Trump is awful, and not the party. Many Republicans could be, moderates who don't like Trump, could be convinced to vote for Biden, but then down.
Yeah, well, it almost seems like Biden was actively encouraging that. You almost get the impression Biden was almost like it was kind of a victory of his, I guess, bipartisan spirit to be like, oh, loads of people are going to be voting for me for president, but they're going to be voting Republican down ticket. And it was almost like that was
liberals
that was
don't
the
like
thing
winning.
He was proud of. Like, yes, there's going to be loads of people voting for me for president, but then they're going to be voting for Republicans when it comes to the Senate. And then later on, oh no, we lost the Senate. Now I can't do anything with my presidency.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's evidence of that specifically. It's just a theory.
Yeah.
But we'll move on to something that is definitely, there's evidence for, that Donald Trump was trusted on the economy. And we talked about this a bit last week in our video concerning, did the coronavirus help Trump? And we both said yes. And this is from the article again by Asita. There were warning signs many months ago that Trump and Republicans wouldn't be as damaged by the pandemic as Democrats assumed. According to an NPR analysis, Trump improved on his 2016 numbers in, this is incredible, 68 out of the 100 counties with the highest COVID death rates per capita. So, of the 100 counties that had the highest, he improved in 68. Wow, that's incredible. Obviously, voters indifferent to Trump's handling of the crisis wouldn't have much trouble giving their Republican members of Congress a pass on this issue too. Trump consistently led Biden on the issue in the polls. In hindsight, this shouldn't have been that surprising. Trump and the GOP crusaded against lockdowns on short-sighted economic grounds, and as paltry as many journalists and policy analysts rightly believe the government's stimulus efforts have been, they meaningfully improved the finances of many voters. And as you can see, there's a load of stats now from the article up on screen showing how well that voters thought their economic position was, and many thought it was decent. Basically, and we repeat what we said last week. Gallup found that 56% of Americans believe themselves to be better off than they were 4 years ago. And Basita says that positivity didn't make up for Trump's vulnerability on other issues, but it might have helped Republicans down ballot, especially given Democrats' inability or unwillingness to focus on a real economic counter-narrative or counter-agenda.
Basically, the Democrats, we pointed out how weird it is that it's almost as if nobody drew any economic conclusions from the stimulus bill, and certainly the Democrats failed to account for how they were going to incorporate that into their narrative, which would have been such an obviously smart thing to do, to take the fact that a economic stimulus that helped the common person and improve things for the average person should lend or lean people towards democratic ideals, but then I guess that would also be a progressive message. So you can see the double bind they were in.
Yeah. We can't have that, can we? But that's the thing. In 2018, one of the reasons why they were successful, I think, is because they did define themselves.
Yeah.
We talk about in 2020 they didn't, but in 2018 they did. They ran on healthcare. And people really do forget that, but that's what the Dems really did run on. And they pitched to America. They were the party of protecting healthcare. Pre-existing conditions were the thing that they were concerned about. And of course, in this election, Trump has been accused of trying to overturn the pre-existing conditions via the courts. And that is, of course, true, but it wasn't a central message to the Biden campaign. He had, the soul of the nation. And I keep repeating that phrase, but it's true. That's what he was talking about on his campaign trails, not, like healthcare. And he may have done ads on it, but in the debates, that was hardly brought up. And it's really, shocking. Like, if the Democrats defined what they were for, protecting pre-existing conditions, they would have, I think, undoubtedly done better down ballot. In 2020, if it's about, look how awful Trump is, and I think that just worked because it was against Trump. Running on checks or protecting healthcare, it would have worked. Back in March, I don't know if you remember, but Nancy Pelosi didn't really want stimulus checks. She was very nervous against it because of the Democrats' ideological convictions when it comes to austerity. They didn't want to give people lots of money. And that of course trickles down to then, running these campaigns or backing these candidates when none of them can really run on this message because it's not a party-wide thing. And I think, we talked about last week how the Democrats lost black voters, for instance, and none of them have had a reckoning on this. That's the thing I'm concerned about with the future. None of them have actually thought about this. Have you seen the recent interview with Barack Obama?
No, I haven't. No, tell me about it.
Well, basically, in his interview, they were talking about losing the black vote. Obama had a response, and it wasn't that Trump gave them, stimulus checks to African Americans, Latino voters, and that helped, and Biden didn't provide an alternative. Obama has a different theory, and he says, yes, and this indication of parts of popular culture that I've missed. So it's basically saying it's down to the culture. It's interesting. People are writing about the fact that Trump increased his support among black men in the 2020 presidential election, and the occasional rapper who supported Trump. I have to remind myself that if you listen to rap music, it's all about the bling, the woman, the money. A lot of rap videos are using the same measures of what it means to be successful as Donald Trump is. Everything is gold-plated. I can't believe that. This insinuates itself and seeps into the culture. So essentially, because Trump is like a rapper, that's why black men gravitated towards him. This is just the fucking do rappers even rap about that anymore? That seems like something to rap about. That's like
the old woman interpretation of rap, just or the angry old man. All they do is rap about their bling and their hose. And it's
oh God, Obama is so out of touch, and if he's saying that, he probably genuinely believes it because it's incredibly embarrassing. And I'm sure that maybe many Democrats high up now believe that as well, or believe something similar. And they're so out of touch, and they don't. Oh my God, fucking hell! I can't believe he actually said that. Obama, he sounds literally like a white, a suburban moderate Republican.
No, yeah, he definitely does.
That's what he sounds like. And I bring that up just then because I think it's a counter to the theory that we're proposing, and it's a stupid counter, by the way, but that black men turned out more for Trump because of the economic stimulus and the money he gave them, and rather than, that Trump's like a rapper. But anyway, we'll move on to another theory, which is, I think probably, along with the messaging, the lack of messaging, this really hurt Democrats quite a bit. It's the lack of a good ground game. And so this is from Masita again. In a widely discussed interview from the New York Times, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez focused largely on Democratic underinvestment in organizing. She said there's a reason Barack Obama built an entire national campaign apparatus outside of the DNC. And the reason why he didn't activate or continue that, well, we lost House majorities. Because the party, in and of itself, does not have the core competencies, and no amount of money is going to fix that. I mean, that's true. You think of when Obama just blew the Republicans out of the water in 2008, and then he quickly dismantled that movement, and look what happened.
Yeah.
The Democrats then consistently lost elections, almost 1,000 seats across the country in all branches of government, and then lost in 2016, and then were just like Republicans were one state away from being able to change the Constitution because they had so many people elected. And the DNC clearly just isn't good at running elections. And this, again, as she points out, is non-ideological. Ocasio-Cortez went on to argue that Democrats should be working on more than just building out conventional campaign infrastructure. We need to do a lot of anti-racist deep canvassing in the country, because if we keep losing white shares and just allowing Facebook to radicalize more elements of white voters and the white electorate, there's no amount of people of colour and young people that you can turn out to offset that. The scoffing this portion of the interview initially provoked among her critics has been followed in the days by statements from Democrats to her right who seemingly agree, including Alabama Senator Doug Jones, another incumbent who lost last week despite hewing to the center. The DNC spent too much time investing in candidates and not the electorate. They don't invest in House districts and they don't invest in states. And I think that's completely true. I mean, what is the one state in the 2020 election where Joe Biden matched his poll numbers in swing states? What was the one state? It was Georgia. Yeah. He actually is going to win by like a small margin, and he's predicted to win by a small margin.
Stacey Abrams.
Why was that? Well, Stacey Abrams had this massive, get out of the vote campaign and registered so many voters and, really did her best. And look at that. Well, the Democrats, won the state by about what they were predicted. Just north of that in North Carolina, they're going to lose by, or they're going to get 4% less than they would have suspected. And that's the thing. I mean, Biden lost in places where like cannabis, raising the minimum wage, won, and voters maybe didn't know that Biden stood for those things. I mean, he actually doesn't stand for legalizing cannabis, but he did for raising the minimum wage. And you that's progressive messaging, but it's just like, the minimum wage, for instance, we talked about it last week. He ran on that. He advocated for that. And you have a better ground game, and then you combine those two, and voila, what have you got? You've got people turning out to vote for you in places like Florida, which passed that $15 minimum wage law. So, and it seems to me that a lack of a good ground game really hurt the Democrats, and the only reason why they won a state like Georgia is because their ground game was good. So if that's the biggest evidence to me, and it seems to be the case for AOC as well. Again, it's not really ideological, it's just competence.
No, I kind of agree with you. And that's something I thought for a while, and I thought it about in the UK as well. I really think this idea that you need to pick the ideology to be electable, I think it's a really wrong-headed aspect of a lot of how the left-wing party in whatever country that is, wherever the Overton window is, seems to have going for it, which is that they think they need to pick the ideology that will get them elected, when the reality is you can pick any ideology and it will get you elected as long as you have the a good competence when it comes to selling that ideology. And it's mostly about how competent your leader is. I mean, for example, both you and I have said before that we have our issues with Jeremy Corbyn, and I think a lot of those issues come down to how good of a job he did at selling himself. and the fact that he could have been a better leader when it came to reining in the rest of his party that was against him, things like that. And that's what it comes down to. And to be honest, actually, I know that we weren't necessarily going to talk about this, but there was an article that I saw which was basically saying, and I'm not going to quote it too directly, but it was basically saying that, we know that the progressives are bad because the progressives didn't do very well relative to how well Biden did. And, if the progressives were good, they would have done better than Biden. That was essentially the argument of the article. But that's obviously wrong, because what it comes down to is, how do the Democratic leaders do at selling their message? And any ideology, like I say, can be effective if it is run effectively. And yeah, that's pretty much always been my position. That it's not about there's one ideology you pick. And to be honest, I think people who say like, if the Democrats ran a progressive message, they'd automatically win. Those people are wrong too. The reality is, though, that running a progressive message does mean you can get more enthusiasm on the ground level than you can with what the Democrats currently have, which is, as you said, wishy-washy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at places like Michigan and Arizona, the Biden campaign didn't really focus on door knocking. People in those states did door knocking as well as Georgia, and Biden won Michigan, won Arizona. And without that, he might not have done it in those two states. It's just crazy how incompetent the DNC was this election. And the congressional Democratic, campaigns for, all the Democrats in the House was run by a guy called Robbie Mook. And if you don't know who Robbie Mook is, he was the guy that ran Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. That didn't go too well, did it? I think she lost. So again, the Democrats just consistently rewarding failure. And we talked about Jamie Harrison. He might be the next head of the DNC. And of course, he lost his race in South Carolina by like 10%. The Democrats just, again, it's not ideological. It's just, we do these things. We knock on doors, we increase turnout. Messaging can help, obviously, but we do things that are quite simple, and we turn out voters and we win. And that's what happened in Georgia. But apparently the Democrats still don't get the message. But in contrast, the GOP do. CETA points out that the Democratic Party organizational weaknesses have deep roots and reflect a long-standing strategic asymmetry between our two parties. That was the conclusion of Daniel Galvin, Daniel Schultzman, and Sam Rosenfield, who say Republican presidents going back to Eisenhower have systematically invested in their party's organizational capacities at the national, state, and local levels, funding local party-building initiatives, assiduously recruiting activists, volunteers, and candidates, teaching campaign techniques, and launching fundraising systems. Democratic presidents, in contrast, have repeatedly emphasized enacting policies over party building. And this doesn't surprise me at all, because the GOP also always seem to want to win, while the Democrats just don't really care that much about winning. And that is the key difference between the two parties, along with ideology, of course. But yeah, that's the key thing. The GOP actually want to actually go out and win, which makes a big difference if you actually try. I mean, we talked about last week Starr County, and I read this week that this Starr County is this poor place in the valley in Texas near the Rio Grande. It flipped like 30 points towards Donald Trump from Joe Biden, and it's a very poor Latino area, and the GOP went and knocked on doors in Starr County. They went and canvassed, and the people felt listened to, they felt heard, and with the stimulus checks, of course, that Trump had given them, they probably felt, okay, yeah, let's give this guy a shot. He's clearly cares about me to some degree. And that's the thing, not just on the presidential side, but on the congressional side. I think door knocking matters a lot more, because voters are flooded with information about presidents. They have the debates and all of that, but other races not so much. Senate, congressional, definitely legislature. So door knocking can make a big difference in that regard.
Basically. And I mean, it's kind of crazy, because obviously the Republicans, in some sense, I think the other thing with the Republicans is they're very shameless about the fact that they are completely insincere in their campaigning. So the Republicans will obviously have the advantage of being able to get the support of lots of big multi-millionaire companies, because those companies know that they can count on the Republicans to support them and pretty much, work to their self-interest. And yet the Republicans are also completely willing to go out and say to the white working class people that the Democrats aren't going to stand up for them and support what's right for them.
And this year you could say, hey, Trump gave you your stimulus checks, he gave you your Trump bucks. So again, like you couldn't be cynical about it, but actually this year you could make a pretty convincing argument to those voters, say in Starr County, that that narrative that the Dems don't care about you and the Republicans care about the working class is true.
Yeah.
And that's why I think we saw such a big
it's kind of crazy
change.
that Republicans are able to get better optics. But I think the thing is that, of course, the Democrats could make an argument against the Republican position, the Republican talking point, but they didn't.
Yeah, but they didn't.
And that's so.
Yeah, they didn't. So they could, but they didn't. And we have to also consider that Trump, he's not very popular with quite a large percentage of the country, but he's very popular with another large percentage of the country, but not quite as much. He was a turnout machine, and he excited his base. And here's the key thing. And it kind of relates to the door knocking and, the canvassing, but Trump found a lot more non-college white voters this time around. He got everything out of that demographic that he could. And it's the right move, I guess. Trump has a natural appeal to those white working class voters. And based on, the evidence, so many more people voted for him this time around than last time. It wasn't a case of diminishing returns with those voters.
Yeah.
And because those voters don't vote that much traditionally, white working class voters who haven't gone, to college, it makes sense to try and push it because there's plenty available and he does really well. And that tactic almost worked. And that might explain the massive gap in the polls. If these white non-college voters traditionally don't vote in high numbers are now voting massively in 2020, obviously the polls are, they're probably going to miss it. If you're not expecting all these voters to vote and they do end up voting, the polls are going to be wrong. I think if you look at the polling, they probably predict that Biden was going to get the amount of votes that he got, but it was just Trump racking up these votes. That was what surprised me on election night. Trump just getting so many more votes than he did in 2016. But clearly the Trump campaign saw that, there's a lot of white working class voters still to be had out there. Trump did really well with him. And, look at that. Like the margins between the polarization, I guess, between the country probably increased ever more in this election, depending on geographic area, rural, urban, who are you voting for? And for example, Wisconsin, the share of the non-white vote in Wisconsin went from 47% to 55%.
Yeah.
Which, would normally signal good news for Trump. But again, so many people hated Trump that, it just cost him in the end.
Oh, yeah.
Michael, anything to sum up with to conclude on?
Well, I think the main takeaway here is that, like we say, the Democrats didn't do that well, and you could say, it's a quirk of the Electoral College that they won by, in technicality, so few votes, even though they millions more people voted for them. In reality, they won by relatively few votes, and you could say, it's just a technicality. But I think it shows part of the issue is that they need to actually have a base they can point to. And I think it's interesting because you look at the map a lot of the time and you think in theory, you're like, well, a lot of these places, they feel like the Democrats should win them. You're like, the Democrats, they usually do well in Michigan and things like that. And it's kind of a sense that you think the Democrats should be, and you look at Texas and you think, the Democrats are gaining there. And you almost think like the Democrats should be, when you almost look at the demographics and the electoral kind of map of it all, and you think, the Democrats should kind of have the upper hand in this. And then obviously you look in reality and they don't seem to have done as well. It's kind of a bit nail-biting for the Democrats when it comes down to the election. And why is it? Well, it's because, I don't know, like the generous thing would be to say almost that they're overconfident and just like, we're going to win no matter what. I think the worst scenario is just they genuinely don't care. And it's just, they don't have this message that they can sell because their only message is they're not the Republicans and they're very reluctant to actually stand for something meaningful. And that's ultimately, why they underperformed. If that's one reason, it's because who wants them to perform when they don't have much that they can actually fight for?
If the Democrats got a trifecta, which they still might get, in the House, in the Senate and the presidency, like what massive things are they going to do, to change the country? Well, probably not. They're probably going to make some minor changes, but nothing that noticeable. Maybe the pandemic would shift that because, of course, the stimulus checks might be necessary, but in a normal year, they probably wouldn't do anything massive. And that's the thing. I look at their failures in this election. It's a combination of not defining themselves and not running on populist things. Those two combined makes a big difference. And then not having a ground game either. So you have a voter who isn't getting, knocked on, the Democratic candidate isn't knocking on their door. They don't know what the Democratic Party stands for, and if they do, it's not something populist. And they look at the GOP, they're knocking on their door. The GOP are saying, hey, look what we did with your stimulus checks. They're defining themselves like, we can help you. We're the party that actually looks after your back. And, that's why. That's why they did so well, the GOP. And I think it was a strategy from the start from Joe Biden to go after, white suburban moderates. They didn't consider the Latino vote as, a part of their path to victory, and it almost cost them. And it's just crazy to think if Trump was just a little less hated, then he might win this. He might have won this if he just wasn't such a prick. And yeah, I mean, God, the Democrats, they are such losers. And again, we talked about the midterms in 2022 a little bit earlier, but they have a really fragile coalition in 2022 because they've got a group of voters who supported Biden who, they vote a lot, to be fair, suburban voters, but they've shown they're not very loyal to the Democrats, and they might again switch to the Republicans once more. And the Democrats, in not going after, the working class vote, might see quite a few losses in 2022.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!